Okay. Can everybody hear me all right? My voice is a little croaky, I'm afraid, a bit of a cold. If you can't hear me, say something. Great. All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight to this Brighton Fuse research event, sponsored and funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council and delivered by the University of Brighton, University of Sussex and Wired Sussex. I'm Phil Jones and I'm the Managing Director of Wired Sussex. You can see, and I'm going to be chairing the event tonight, you can see the running order there. So we're currently on the bit where it says, welcome from event chair, and that's me. Then we're going to look at the findings of the Brighton Fuse research into freelancers in the creative digital economy, followed by a panel discussion and plenty of time for questions and contributions from the floor, a bit of a roundup, and then the bit where we all go to the bar and get a glass of lukewarm white wine. The best bit of the evening, eh? Please, by all means, keep your mobile phones on or your laptops, but if you can turn them on to mute, because it's a bit disconcerting to be interrupted by your wacky choice in mobile phone ringtones. The hashtag is Brighton Fuse. Hashtag Brighton Fuse, as you can see. I wonder if this thing works. Okay, yeah, so as I said, that's me. I want to start off by talking a bit about, actually, I want to start off by finding out who we've got in the audience tonight. So maybe we could start off. If you're actually currently define yourself as a practicing freelancer, can you put your hands up, please? Oh, pretty good. Keep your hands up for a minute. If you've ever done any freelancing in the past, can you raise your hands as well? Wow, that's a fair proportion. Okay, put your hands down. If you work for a business, can you put your hands up? Okay. Keep your hands up, keep your hands up, keep your hands up. And put your hands down now if you work for a business that doesn't employ freelancers. So if you do employ freelancers, keep your hands up. Great. So a vast majority of the audience tonight is either current freelancers, has been freelancing, or works for a company that employs freelancers. And that, I think, demonstrates the importance, even in here tonight, of the role that freelancers play. Oh, what happened there? Oh, there you go. The Brighton Fuse research, of which this research into freelancers is really an offshoot or an addendum, has been significantly important and impactful, I think. As I hope most of you know, it was a 2-3 year, in the end, research project which looked at the creative digital and IT cluster in Brighton. It was the most extensive piece of research into a cluster that's ever taken place in the UK. It's informed a lot of strategy documents, the Greater Brighton City deal, the Coastal Capital Local Enterprise Partnership, strategic plan. Both use significant elements of the research and the findings of the Brighton Fuse to inform them, and both of those strategy documents have been successful in drawing in funding to Brighton from national government. It's been very, very significant in terms of the amount of press it's got. You know, on the day that it was released, it was featured in the Financial Times, and you know, that was a year ago. Even today, it's still mentioned, and we the participants still get requests from the press all over the world to talk about the findings. And the findings really were about the a number of things about the momentum and the scale of the Brighton cluster, which exceeded what we expected, and I think exceeded what many people expected, with a cluster that nearly matches the visitor economy in terms of the impact on the economy of Brighton, and is growing at around 15% per annum. But also the impact of the relationship between the arts, design, and technology, which really is the USP of our cluster. It's been so successful that now other people want to follow in its footsteps. So there's a Bristol Fuse will be launching soon, and there's discussions around a Newcastle Fuse as well. So similar kind of things, trying to use a piece of research like this to raise the profile of a cluster and to help businesses and support agencies really understand what makes that cluster tick, rather than just making assumptions on that. So that was the Brighton Fuse research. The research wasn't about freelancers, but it was clear fairly early on that that researchers were a significant part of the way that the cluster works and operates and engages and creates itself. So one of the key findings was that the average size of a creative or digital company in Brighton is seven staff. Obviously, you've got some with 150, 200 staff and some with just 1 or 2, but the average is 7. But that company, on average, employs 7 freelancers a year. So 7 permanent staff uses 7 freelancers. And just that fact alone told us that there was something significant about the role that freelancers play. So once we'd released the main Brighton Fuse project, we went back to the Arts and Humanities Research Council and said, this is a bit of the research which we think is really, really important, which we haven't covered, and we need to cover it. And that's really been the work of the researchers at the universities over the past year, is really looking at the role that freelancers play in a creative economy. We're here tonight to talk to you about those results. Those of you who get the Sunday Times may have seen an article in the Sunday Times about it yesterday with a headline which didn't necessarily reflect what the research was trying to say, but there is obviously some real interest in this idea of the freelancers economy and the way they play into broader economies. So that's the Brighton Fuse, that's the context for it. And to start with tonight, I'd like to introduce to the stage Jonathan Sapsed. And Jonathan is the principal investigator, i.e. the lead researcher for this piece of research. And he's going to talk you through, for the next half hour or so, the findings from the research. And then we're going to go to a panel session. So please give a big welcome to Jonathan Sapsed.
Thanks very much. Great.
And I'll pass over the baton.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. I'm Jonathan Sapsed, as Phil says. I'm from Centrum, over the road in Edward Street there. But this is very much a joint project with our partners that we'll see more of later in the panel, from SPRU at the University of Sussex and BMEC, and our colleagues here in the Faculty of Arts. And of course, Wide Sussex, our business partner, and funded, of course, by Arts and Humanities Research Council, which I think it's fair to say has really been a driving force, I think, in the agenda on creative economy research over the last 4 or 5 years. So, as Phil said, I'm going to run through really just a kind of taster of some of the results that you'll find in the report. There's a mass of data in there, quantitative data, qualitative, and we can't really present all of it, but I'm just going to give a a taste of some of those key findings that we find from the different sections of the report. First of all, briefly, the research methods that we use to do the research. Then something about the data overview. What does the sample look like in terms of the freelancer cluster here? And how do they perform in terms of the economy? Then we'll look at skill sets and the fusion issue that Phil alluded to earlier. Then we'll look a little bit at freelancers' lifestyles and their motivations, aspirations, and their barriers, and so forth. Then we'll look at Brighton itself as a place of work and networking activities. And finally, we'll conclude and talk a little bit about policy recommendations that we have coming out of the report, because part of this is trying to kind of unearth some of the barriers and difficulties that you're all finding as freelancers and trying to find policies that can actually help with some of those. So, first of all, research methods. So, it's difficult to do research on a hidden population like this. What we found, as Phil said in the first Fuse project, is that we have a significant amount of value which is being generated by these independent professionals. But it's largely a hidden population, right? It's difficult. You can't go to a registered database of freelancers in the same way as you can with companies. And so what we had to do really was kind of build it from the bottom up with the various professional associations like Wired, Sussex, and also meetup groups, co-working spaces, so the Skiff, the Works, the Farm, the Brighton Illustrators Group, and really piecing it together from the bottom up to build this sample. And we got a sample of over 300, which is good. It's a over 25% response rate, which is very good for a survey of this type. And we also back this up with 32 qualitative face-to-face interviews that we recorded and then coded using qualitative data analysis software, and also tested some of these ideas with groups of freelancers, 2 focus groups, because sometimes you get some puzzling results thrown up by the survey, and it's worthwhile to try and find out, try and shed some light on those. So it hasn't been easy. It's not easy to do research on the freelancer population, and we had we were warned actually that freelancers are a willful crowd, right? They're a willful community, and we had a box at the end of the questionnaire that people could add comments. And normally for the firm survey that we get comments like, "Great work, looking forward to the results," and keep it up. And then with freelancers we get things like, "Why don't you hire some professional researchers?" and challenging questions like this. And I didn't like we had some grumbling tweets about that it took 25 minutes to fill out the survey and so forth. And so we know it was difficult and it was hard, but it was worthwhile. I hope you'll agree in terms of getting this, what is quite a robust sample, we think, to do analysis on. So first of all, the data overview and economic performance. This is, so what does it look like, the composition of the sample? And we hear very often that Brighton is full of creatives and not so much on the tech side. And we do find, of course, that over half, and something like 60%, are producing both content and design services. But nevertheless, we do have digital technologies there. KIBS, which is knowledge-intensive business services. Things like consultancy, professional services, and so forth. Marketing services weighing in as well. So there is quite a diverse and varied composition to the sample. How do they perform in terms of income? So here this is somewhat difficult because not everybody is working 100% as a freelancer, right? So some people are working part-time and they have another job, and you can have another employment as well as being freelance. And so what we have here is the lime green part of the chart here. This is the figures which are normalized for full-time equivalent. So as if people were working full-time for the year. And so we find that in terms of the different sectors that are active, that obviously knowledge-intensive business services doing rather well here. Again, we have the programmers, the IT technologies, digital technologies. Then we go down to advertising, design, content production here, and arts and crafts. So again, variation, significant variation among the different sectors, but nevertheless, I think you'd agree that these are the median figures, right? So bear in mind that there's half the population below this figure and half above. So we think these are pretty good in terms of income figures, certainly compared to the national averages. In terms of the sample as a whole, we find a median income for full-time equivalent of 42k, which we think is pretty good. And growth rates, right? So people are growing their business, they're growing in revenues in the same way as we found with the Brighton Fuse firms survey. And I mean, it's been really impressive, I think, to really see the level of professionalism and the business-like nature of the freelancers in the cluster, that they're all doing, you're all doing marketing, accounting, promotional activities, people managing multiple brands, different markets. And this really goes against a lot of what you see in some of the academic literature, for example, which says that, that freelancers really get into the business because they love the product, they love the creativity, but not so much for the management side. But what we find is that people are very, very professional, very businesslike in how they go about their work. And we have a quote here from one of our interviews. I wasn't really thinking of myself as a freelancer, even though that's what I was doing. I thought of myself as a company founder, which I think is indicative. This is the breakdown of revenues by region. So we find a significant amount, nearly 25% international revenues, right? So people selling, this includes all the sort of micro payments of online products and services, as well as serving clients that are in other countries. And this actually, the composition of this is very similar to the firms survey that we found, except that the local market and the London market are still more important for the freelancers. And I think a lot of that is to do with the actual outsourcing of work to other freelancers here, that there's quite a lot of collaboration and co-working in that sense. Innovation as well. I mean, this is something that's very key, of course, to creative digital IT activities. And once again, we find that freelancers are highly innovative as a population. Over 89% are, over 83% have innovated over the last year. In many cases, multiple innovations, 1, 2, 3, and so on. In terms of product development, producing materials that are eligible for copyright, new processes, new business models, and so forth. Once again, as we found with the firm survey, that even though the people are producing materials that are eligible for copyright, not so much on trademarks, and we don't find a lot of revenues that are coming from intellectual property in this sense. So that's kind of an interesting thing, and we'd like to hear more from you later about why that must be. It was something that came up a lot in the firm survey, and the issue, the difference between actually creating value and capturing it in terms of royalties to yourself rather than for your client. So it could be a critique that people are doing all this innovation, but it's not them that are benefiting; it's actually the clients. So that's something that we can perhaps touch on later on. Let's talk about skills and fusion. So fusion, you'll remember, hopefully, from the first survey that the idea of fusion being where you're combining or integrating knowledge sets from arts and humanities and design with technology, bringing them together to produce something new. And this is something which is key to the creative digital IT sectors. And we found 3 cohorts, 3 groups in the first survey. So the first ones are the unfused, who are really quite specialized and don't really depend on this integration of knowledge for their business. Then we have the fuse, which is where they're, to some extent, they're starting to integrate and combine these knowledge sets. And then you had a group, the superfused, who are juggling all these many different knowledge bases to produce the products and services for their clients. And it's interesting to compare the freelancers against the firms in this sense, because what we find is that the freelancers are even more superfused than the firms. So we find 46% as opposed to 34.7 with the firms. And this is a very interesting finding because it raises the question about what does it mean to be a superfused individual. You can think about it more in terms of firms where you might employ some designers and some programmers and some arts people as well, and combine them with marketing and business skills. Does that necessarily scale down to an individual in the same way? And we talked a lot about this in the focus groups and trying to understand this issue. Because one of the pieces of advice that you hear a lot at Wide Sussex freelancer mentoring workshops and so on is that people say, you know, you need to specialize as a freelancer. You can't be a jack of all trades or a Jill of all trades, right? That this raises suspicions that can you really be good at all these different things? And one of the quotes that we had in the interviews was that people that are really good at all these different skills are like unicorns, right? So, meaning that they're very rare or even fictional, right? So there are very few people that are good at all the skills. Nevertheless, what we see here, this is the way that freelancers are spending their activity. This is how they spend their time. And you can see, I mean, don't worry too much about the details, but the different colors represent coding and design and programming and so forth, as well as on the creative side. And there is a real mix of activities that people are doing. So this is kind of a puzzle that we're interested in that it is different from the firms in that sense, and trying to make sense of that. And hopefully you can help with that later on. What does it mean for performance? So this is one of probably the most interesting findings from the first Fuse project, is that those companies that were superfused were growing 3 times more than the ones that were unfused. And as you go from unfused to fused to superfused, you find higher income. And we find the same effect with the freelancers. Here you can see that as we get more fused, we get more income. But in terms of growth, we find actually that the superfused do not grow significantly more in revenues, in income, than the fused and the unfused. On the contrary, we find that they grow less. And this is sort of a puzzling result, right? So we've been thinking this through and bouncing around some ideas with our focus groups about why this might be. And we think that, you know, this really displays one of the differences between individuals and between companies, and that, you know, there are natural limits to what individuals, the extent to which an individual can grow or would wish to grow. And I think a lot of this shows that when people get to a certain level of income, they don't necessarily want to grow anymore. Then they would set up a business and they would hire people to do that work. And that a lot of the joy and motivation of being a freelancer is that you can do side projects and you can take a couple of days off a week and you can have a family. How about that? And perhaps do some artworks or do some voluntary work. We found significant activity in that area. So again, we find that there are these natural limits to the growth of freelancers. What about how do people get these skills? So we found in terms of the top 3 channels for everyday skills that people are drawing on in their jobs, learning on the job, number 1, self-learning. And this is something that has been really accelerated by the internet, of course. You have all kinds of blogs, all kinds of sites, YouTube, TED Talks, and so on. A code store in terms of technical information. And one of the quotes here is that, you know, the world is full of blogs and people telling you exactly how to solve all sorts of weird, obscure problems that you'd never come across before. You can do huge amounts of self-learning and you don't need formal training processes. And this we heard again and again in the interviews, that people are finding that, particularly for technical issues, you can generally find a solution to almost any problem online. Somebody's had that problem before, and they helpfully post it on the internet about how to deal with it. Fair to say this is mostly on the technical side. People do say that for things, the softer skills, people management skills, then you do have a role for formal training. And you do have a role for higher education degree, which is nice for those of us in higher education. That we find that there is a role for the higher education degree. This is something which is one of the top 3 sources of skills that people find is useful. And we find that you are a highly educated population. Over 60% have an undergraduate degree. Over 22% have a postgraduate degree. In which subjects? Again, arts and humanities and design do well. Over 50% there, but there's STEM. There's the business school. There's also kicking in there with some freelancers. But again, sort of quite a range, I think, of different degrees that we see in the pool of freelancers throughout the cluster. And again, this I think serves to show the subtlety of the skills that are required for the creative economy now, that it's not just about getting more STEM graduates, that we do need those arts, design, humanities graduates as well in order to get this fusion effect. It's the combination of the skill sets that is key. Let's talk about life, motivations, well-being, and challenges. So this is rather nice. This is you've heard of pie charts, right? But this is I call this the Danish pastry chart, which is invented by our designers, Pure Design. And so this infographic shows the reasons, the motivations for freelancing. And overwhelmingly what it shows is the aspirations in this outer ring here are the key category in terms of why people are freelancing. And this is to realize their own business ideas and also aspiration in terms of flexibility, gaining some flexibility and control and autonomy over their working lives. Then we have some that are a middle category, which is to do with getting better pay. I rather like this quote here. It's almost like a conspiracy with the freelancers. It's like, why should we be long-term? Why should we take a lower day rate? So you do find a large number who are saying that they freelance because they get paid better. Rather more than those that are doing it out of necessity. And here we include some of the people that are that have been made redundant and perhaps couldn't find a job in a business that they wanted. But this tends to be the ones that are stressed in all the discourse on this, right? Politicians, policymakers, the trade unions, all tend to say this is displaced labour, right? This is a secondary reserve army of labour that is, exploited by the firms. Really, they should have jobs, they should have benefits, and so forth. What we find is that necessity is not the key motivator, at least for this sector, right? So creative digital IT, we know these are high growth sectors. We're not really talking here about van drivers and cleaners and so on. So obviously there will be freelancers who are struggling to get by. And this is sort of the Premier League of freelancers in a way. But nevertheless, I think it's important to point out that people are largely doing this out of choice and aspiration. Well-being. So this is important because there is this discourse about well-being and about the fact that there's usually a pretty gloomy interpretation, a dismal view of freelancers' life. And so we wanted to compare with national averages. And yesterday, as Phil said, the Sunday Times story was getting sacked is the road to bliss, which was not quite the message that we wanted to put out, especially because our bosses were reading. But we did want to get a sense really of how does the population here compare to all the population, which is the dark here, the self-employed and the self-employed in creative industries more generally. And the Brighton freelancers are the lime green column here. And basically what this shows is that really you're no happier and no more unhappy than the rest of these populations. It's consistent with the rest. So you're not unhappy because you're freelancing. If anything, you're a little bit happier and a little bit more anxious. Right? So maybe that's a personality type of freelancing. I know people that are only happy if they're anxious, right? So this is kind of an important thing, but not statistically significantly so, right? So this is largely consistent with the rest of the population. And this is backed up by plans for the future. We find here that asked, what would you prefer? Would you rather have a job, or would you prefer to continue freelancing? 94% said they prefer to be self-employed. That's pretty clear, isn't it? Plans for the future, 95.7% want to continue being self-employed. And 75% nearly want to broaden the scope, right? So they want to open up new vistas and new markets and new artistic pursuits in their freelancer work. And so broaden the scope of what they're doing. Having said that, there are problems. There are always barriers and difficulties, and these come under sort of three headings, really: money, activities to do with freelancing, and acquiring skills. We'll talk a bit more about this in the panel, but just to highlight a few of them, the most important ones are irregular income, obviously, unstable, uncertain, lack of benefits, right? Pensions, sick leave, the ability to take holidays and still get paid and so forth. Difficulties on getting paid promptly by clients, something that we hear a lot. And these are things that perhaps policy can address, we think, at a national and perhaps local level as well. Place of work and networking. Brighton itself. Here we find, so this is interesting, and we're happy to see so many freelancers here tonight, because looking at the data, it looks like freelancers don't get out that much, right? 89% are working at home as the main workplace. Well, this is actually one of the top three, I think. And people do complain about an isolation, being at home. And some of those people, therefore, that's why they join co-working spaces like the Skiff and like the Works and the Annex and so on. And those people that do that, they do find tremendous benefits from doing so. Cafes and bars is interesting. There was an article in The Guardian recently, you may have seen, which talked about how there was another survey which showed that Brighton has the highest per capita consumption of coffee than any other UK city, including London, which is very interesting. It talked about the numbers of independent cafes we have here. And that article attributed this to the numbers of freelance individuals that are there, sitting there with their Apple Macs. But also what we found is that cafes and bars are very important for meeting clients, right? It's a good place to meet clients and which are not otherwise available to people. So we do find over 22% using cafes and bars as an important place of work. One or two other places, of course, that we can speculate about. And then, one of the interesting things about creative economy and clusters is that people always stress the importance of networking and collaboration. So we do find that, in terms of, there's not a lot of networking. The creative community, they will go to Jake Spicer's life drawing sessions and the festival and so on. And the digital community, they will go to the farm and talk to the other techies there. And we do find that those that claim to be super fused, they are identifying more with both the creative and the digital communities. But we've got over half here that don't feel part of any community. And they're not necessarily unhappy about that. They're possibly quite satisfied about that. Would like to hear what, there are sort of contradictions here, right, in terms of this, that people are attracted to Brighton because of all the creative talent that's here, but on the other hand, people don't seem to be making use of it so much. So why is this? We'd love to hear more. And here we see, right, the people, 56% think networking is very important for getting ideas, for socializing, for getting business. But only 20% actually do any networking, right? Very, very little in terms of actual face-to-face. There's a bit more in terms of online networking and social networks. But in terms of very frequently meeting at meetups and so on, not so much. And as I say, the people that do partake of co-working spaces and meetups and so on, they have high praise for those opportunities and the benefits of them. So to conclude, didn't mean to do that. To conclude, so as I've said, creative digital IT freelancers, on average, I think it's fair to say, prosperous, enjoying income growth, good levels of well-being. They are more superfused than the firms, but with this limited growth rate that we observed. They largely prefer freelancing. to realize their aspirations and plan to expand, but they do experience barriers in terms of money and freelancing and skills. So we have various policy recommendations that follow from a lot of these barriers and challenges, and they come under three headings, really. First of all, the question of equalizing the rights of freelancers with employees of firms, right? So things like maternity, paternity leave, which is not as available as you would have if you're an employee in a company. Very important for early childcare. What we found is that many freelancers find the flexibility of freelancing to be helpful for early stage of young families and so forth, but you do face this disadvantage of not having maternity and paternity leave. So that's an obvious one, but there are, all policies, innovation policies, industry policies tend to assume that you're dealing with limited company businesses or larger companies, and they don't tend to think about freelancers. And that's just one example. There's others like creative industry tax relief. You need to be a limited company in order to be eligible for this, which is not necessarily a problem, because we found 40% of the freelancers do have their own limited companies anyway. But nevertheless, I think it illustrates that policymakers always come with this mindset of employment rather than self-employment, and that needs to change because the trends are that this is a population that's increasing. Then we have problems of access to finance, and here this is rather different to venture capital and seed capital, these kinds of problems that you hear a lot about with firms. But here it's about getting a mortgage, right? And getting a bank manager who can empathize with difficulties like clients not paying on time and having short-term cash flow issues and this kind of thing. So what we say in the report is that we recommend a freelancer-friendly, specific small business account, bank account which could be government-backed and perhaps with Lloyds or one of the other banks which has strong links with the government. And this could also provide advice on longer-term financial planning like pensions and so forth, and mentoring, especially for those early career freelancers. Thirdly, there's a whole area of awareness and value, and this works on both sides, right? Because a lot of freelancers are saying, you feel like you're constantly justifying your fees, all the time to clients. You wouldn't work for 40 quid a day, so why are you asking me? This sort of thing. So there's need for a public information campaign, we think, about the value of what people are producing, how much for a website, how much for a presentation template with an attractive color range and so forth. But also on the freelancer side, some guidelines about setting rates. How much should you be giving quotes for, and what are the various business models that are available to people? People explain this is not something that people generally talk about when they're down the pub at the meetup, and so it would be useful to have some well-researched, it would have to be regionally adjusted guidelines to guide people on these sorts of things. And also, finally, there's a lot of existing policies and laws and rules that could be made use of but are not. And we find that a lot of this is that it's just that people perceive them to be much more difficult than they actually are, or prohibitively unaffordable and so on. So we think there's a lot of existing policies, advice on taking clients to a small claims court if they're being tardy with payments and so on. So there's a lot of that kind of information which is already available that needs to be made more clear, I think, to the existing population rather than introducing new policies. And that, I think, is the role for Wired Sussex and intermediaries in that sense. So finally, I think the great thing about this is that we've managed to kind of unearth and surface all this value that you've created, right? So and to really kind of get the recognition that all this work deserves, right? And we have this is the Minister of State for Culture and Digital Economy. His response to the report: the study shows the self-employed play a key role in driving the culture of innovation in the creative digital industries, and a vital part of Britain's economic growth. So it's great. Now we have this data, we can start to really get the recognition for it and start to think about challenging some of those difficulties and barriers that are produced. And we think you should all feel very happy with yourselves. So I'll leave it there, and we'll move on to the panel.
One, two. Thank you very much, Jonathan, for that. There's a lot of information there, I think, and a lot of questions that Jonathan's raised, and some interesting, as he put it, contradictions almost there. So I think there's a lot of that for us to get our hands around now. I think the idea is that there's two microphones. So if you've got questions, we'll be bringing a microphone to you. First of all, I'd like to ask the panel members to come up to the panel, which is down there, which I guess when they do will be bathed in light, otherwise we'll never be able to see them. But Jonathan's already there. Megha, who's an arts researcher for the University of Brighton. Roberto from the University of Sussex. Monica from the University of Sussex. And also we've invited John Norris from Crunch to join the panel as well. Look at that, light. Fantastic. So, whilst you're thinking of your questions, I'm going to kick off with one of my own. And I'd just like to ask each of the panel members in turn, probably starting with you, Jonathan, there at that end, just to tell us, from your perspective, what was the piece of information that came out of the research that you least expected, and what do you think the implications or the consequences of that is? And then we'll ask each of those people that in turn. So at this end, you've got some time to think about it.
Yeah. Okay, well, usually with a research project like this, you start off with looking at the previous research that has been done. And there has been some research that has been done, but mainly on individual sectors within the creative industries. And it's generally a sort of pretty gloomy picture, I think, and generally showing freelancers to be not quite so competent in terms of business, in terms of marketing, promotion, and not enjoying that part of it. So I think what has been really quite surprising, I think, is just the overall level of professionalism, and things like running multiple brands and identities and so on that we found in terms of the interviews and the way that people conduct themselves. And at the same time, of course, we find that there are barriers at the same time, which is why we start to talk about policy implications in terms of freelancer-friendly bank accounts and so forth, which we include in the report.
Great, thanks. Megha?
I found through interviews, I was interviewing a lot of the freelancers, and I found that freelancers are very innovative people. They call themselves creative. I interviewed a range of different freelancers, right from very creative arts a sector to the digital and the very technical end. But at the same time, a lot of the freelancers working very, very hard, but having all these incredible side projects, and some to monetize, but also 40% of freelancers said they were volunteering, they were doing work for using their skills to not earn money, but to actually do something else that they really believed in. And I think that was really incredible. It wasn't just about using your skills and time to earn money, but this 40% of the freelancers are using half a day in the week to do other things. So that was my main point.
To me, the most surprising thing was that freelancing is not a second best choice, but it's something like a deliberate career path that people go for. Like, people always think of freelancer going into freelancing because they are forced by the lack of proper job outside or because they are made redundant. But 80% of our samples show that people go into freelancing because they want to fulfill their aspirations. They want to have more flexibility and they want to pursue their own business ideas. I think it's quite striking. And even the fact that 94% of freelancers say that they would prefer keeping being a freelancer rather than be an employee, I think, again, it's quite striking. There's something more than like lacking opportunities outside. It's more like fulfilling your own aspirations.
So, John, as a freelancer and as someone who used to run freelancer.co.uk, is that right? Yeah.
Freelance Advisor.
Freelanceadvisor.co.uk. What's your take on what surprised you in the research?
I thought that the most surprising thing was the stat about how freelancers feel not involved with the community. I suppose that might be partially because I kind of make an effort to come to things like this and involve myself in a community. But knowing other freelancers, and even some particularly reclusive freelancers, they still consider themselves to be part of a community. So I was quite surprised that, 51% said they didn't feel part of a community. That, especially in a place like Brighton, I thought that was quite strange. And also contrast that with the fact of so many people said that networking and events were so important to their business. There were people that filled out the survey that said, yeah, networking is really important to my business, but I never go to any. It's like, it's like, it struck me as a bit of a strange contradiction, I suppose.
Yeah.
The most surprising thing for me was to participate to a workshop organized by the Freelance Association, PCG, now IPSI, that took place in London before we collected this data. And they invited a lot of experts, other academics, and lawyers and so on. And they listed so many negative views and negative aspects of freelancing that I was kind of, when I came back home, I was really sad and said, we're gonna study people who are really struggling and so on. And then we collected the data. We basically disproved all of them. For example, they said that freelancers, they do not promote themselves very well. We found that half of them have a brand. They actually promote themselves. Many of them even have two brands, so they have multiple identities they do use to promote different segments, And they said that they do not acquire new skills, and we found that more than half of them, they acquire new skills in the previous 12 months, and when they need to acquire new skills, they can do it on a daily basis in their job and so on. They said that many of them are really vulnerable, they are forced into freelancing. Well, we found that well-being is quite high, at least comparable with the average, and that nobody's forced to be a freelancer. On the contrary, as Monica was saying, most of them, they do it because they want to do. So I think that what is surprising is that there are all these negative connotations, that the public might have, and even the fact that this was organized by the Freelancing Association, that they were trying to highlight the best aspects. I think that we really need these type of studies and this type of robust and reliable data to try to legitimize freelancing in the UK, because I think that all these negative, maybe not all, but most of these negatives view could be really disproved with real data.
Cool. Okay, we're going to open it up to the floor now. So, great. Oh, lots of hands. So, the first one there, then I see you, and then you. Yeah.
Hello. A very simple technical question. When you do the income figures, you say like the actual income that they get, and you do a full-time equivalent. I just want to know, when you convert the actual hour worked into the full-time equivalent, do you take into account all the non-chargeable hours that the freelancers have to do, like all the taxes, admin, and promoting yourself that a full-time employee wouldn't have to do? Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Roberto.
well, there are two different things. One is about we asked them, what's your income? What has been your gross income in the previous year? And then we also asked them what are the activities that they do. And some of the activities are, administrative, marketing, and so on. But then when we calculated that, we calculated based on the percentage of their working time they spend doing freelancing. So if they said, I spend freelancing 60% of my working time, we use that figure, which includes everything, basically.
So did you count the time spent admin and marketing yourself, which is working time? Oh,
yeah,
okay, sorry.
Yeah, we did.
Cool. So it's up there.
I wanted to ask about the actual terminology of freelancing. You can try to disaggregate in your freelancers particular segments within that.
Yeah. So how did you actually define freelancing? Is a good basic question, isn't it? Who's going to take that one?
I guess I should.
Okay,
defining
he really did it all, didn't he?
No, defining freelancing has been really an argument. The terminology is very different, so many different freelancers, they call themselves with different names. What are these names, like freelancer,
Contractors,
subcontractors. So we found all these problems in defining freelancers, and also there's not a unique legal status in the UK. So what we did was basically we took the approach that Labour Force Survey does, and this is explained in the report. So we do not disaggregate within freelancers, but we ask them if they work under one of the definitions that the Labour Force Survey uses. So that's what we did.
And how did that work out? Did people think that they fit into one box?
We asked them if they could fit in at least one of these boxes, and then they were considered freelancers. For example, some freelancers have LTD status with no employees, and in this case we consider them freelancers, even though technically they are also firms, because they are registered in Companies House. Some other freelancers they work under an umbrella company, and these are considered freelancers by the Labour Force Survey. Some others are sole traders. Some others, they just fill in a self-return tax once a year. So all these categories have been included.
All right. I mean, so this disaggregation is not really on the basis of the freelancers in this economy, what kind of things they do. The kind of categorization with appeal to this economy doesn't necessarily fit into the categorization you've had to use. Yeah, because the categorization we uses a mixture of real legal status, but we also ask them a more generic question: you work for yourself. The thing is, we try to capture what you're saying using the sectors. Where basically we ask freelancers to describe their activity, so they wrote down, or if during the interviews by phone they explain briefly what they do, and also we ask them to tick one of the official DCMS categories for the creative industry. So we used to triangulate the self-described activities and the sector, and we used that to define the sectors you saw, like content, digital, technologies, and so on.
So we.
I'll give you just a quick example. I mean, I would have, described a freelancer as somebody that works in a kind of more likely to work in a specialist context, where they can sell their specialist skills to a larger company that might not need them for such a long time that has to hire someone as a freelancer. Whereas, it's not what I do, which is maybe not what other people describe themselves as doing. I mean, I'm somebody that builds skills, and if I can sell those, then well and good. But if not, then I've still got the skills that still use them.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think.
I'm a creative person rather than somebody that's targeting.
We did have one of the categories of self-employed creatives. So if you are working for yourself, if you have all the skills, you are one person working, and you have all the skills you need to enable you to do that. The term freelancer we are using today is to enable us to, it's for more ease and convenience rather than as a descriptive category, which in the survey was one of those, the self-creative professionals.
Yeah.
So
I suspect that then some of the results you've got, if you could analyse them properly within the sector, what freelancers are, how they break down, so you get some different questions and different answers.
Yeah. So, I mean, that definition of freelancers, how you define freelancers is important, but, and we may well come back to that, but there's a number of other people who've got their hands up. So, there was one there, and then there was one there. Okay, there's a lot. Yeah. All right. So if you can ask your question. Yeah.
Okay.
Please.
Well, I've got a question and a contribution.
Yeah.
So my contribution first. You were asking about people say networking is very important, but they don't go to networking events. Have you considered the internet? Because I do a lot of networking. I mean, especially over Twitter is very important to me. I don't go to very many networking events, but I get pretty much all my work via various social networking things that I do. So I suggest that could be an answer to that question about people not attending networking events.
Actually, the only category that was coming a bit significant for us among the different channels for networking was social media platforms. So that really confirmed what you're saying.
Yes, I think, well, personally, I find that a very, very important channel. My question is about the policy recommendations, because I guess one of my main frustrations as a freelancer, I do quite a lot of contract work, like on-site, daily or hourly rate contracting with clients. And sometimes I feel as though the government is actually sort of vindictively targeting me as, things like R35. So the actual, the tax regime could be reformed to be more favourable to freelancers, because it seems a lot of the time you're just suspected as being, somebody who's a tax dodger who really should be an employee, but you're only doing it to dodge taxes, but that's not the case at all. So I was surprised that wasn't one of the policy recommendations mentioned at the end of the report.
And so effectively you're saying that a more the response of government and HMRC to freelancers should be less cynical and
Absolutely,
suspicious.
yes. Yeah, and they seem to go on these, witch hunts periodically about people. I run a limited company. I'm the sole person in that limited company, and yet I seem to spend, I'm sort of constantly hounded by HMRC suggesting that I should really be an employee. That wouldn't fit the way I work at all.
Yeah.
Sorry, John.
Maybe John should.
I think one of the things that we've discovered at Crunch, working with people very much like yourself, actually, is that a lot of the problem with the way the government legislates isn't necessarily to do with penalising self-employed people, as so much as it is to do with totally ignoring them. And they write lots of policies for SMEs and all these things that they can recognise. And then when they roll them out, actually it has quite dire implications for a lot of self-employed people. I mean, it happened even this year already with some new EU VAT rules. And there was agency workers regulations which came in like 2011 or something like that. And that was designed to protect the van drivers and people that Jonathan was talking about earlier who were low-income self-employed. It was designed to protect them and give them equal rights as employees. And it ended up catching kind of huge swathes of legitimately self-employed people in the same when it was rolled out. So I think the problem is the government needs to sort of build in protections for self-employed people when they're...
Could we declare ourselves as self-employed and happy?
We don't want to exactly, but slightly anxious.
Richard.
I was interested in the growth with the superfused in both the companies and the freelancers. I guess one of the things with freelancers is they may be working flat out anyway, and in order to grow, you've got so many other sort of things that you need to put in there. But bearing in mind that when you did the original work, and it was for the companies that were employing lots of self-employed people anyway, just how much of that growth there was due to the self-employed people rather than the company?
Difficult to say, difficult to calculate. But I mean, as Phil said, we found that on average they're employing 7 employees, and they're also employing 7 freelancers over a year period. So, I mean, you can start to realise that there's a significant proportion. And it tends to be, of course, the difficult to find scarce skills that they have difficulty in recruiting for. So the freelancer pool is there to sort of plug in, very often with the sort of cutting edge, more innovative parts of projects.
The cutting edge bit, which is the bit that gives them the growth.
Yeah, absolutely. So.
And it's the flexibility as well, isn't it? So you hire freelancers when you haven't got the skills in-house, but you also hire freelancers when you suddenly have a spike in your workload, and freelancers can enable you to meet it. So if you didn't have a group of freelancers that you trusted and could call on, you may well have to turn that work down. So in that sense as well, freelancers are crucial.
And similarly, if you're a freelancer and you have a spike in your work, there's very little you can do about it other than to give the work to other people.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess, one of the things is that original research, the Brighton Fuse, which looked at the value to the Brighton economy of the creative, digital and IT sector, didn't actually include freelancers in it because we didn't ask freelancers. So, there's an amount of value that freelancers are creating for this city's economy, which we haven't even yet measured in terms of that original research. Okay, who's next? One there, and then the lady there, and then...
Hi, I just wondered whether you investigated how much freelancers come together to collaborate, whether they collaborate with each other to form a team for an individual project.
That's a really good question. If we take that then.
Yeah, we found that, I think about a third, if I remember well, about a third of them, they hire other freelancers. So they work together. In many cases, we found that they don't hire directly because they don't want, so that one of the main issue for them is that they don't get paid on time, so they don't want to have this risk, you know, for them not to get paid and having to pay another freelancer. So many times, the people that contract other freelancers, they do it through the main contractor, so through the firms or the, you know, or the charity they're working for. And we found that the freelancers that are contracting other freelancers are those, and this links to what you said before, they are those that are growing really faster than the average, and they earn much more than the average, but also they are much, much busier in terms of number of hours they work per week. So when they work too much, then they tend to hire other freelancers. This might be the first step of starting a company, hire employees. And then in terms of other collaboration, we found that a lot of collaboration takes place in co-working spaces. People help each other quite a lot in this environment because these environments are naturally designed to help each other and to discuss and talk about things. However, we found that the other freelancers, those that work at home or at the client premises, they are a bit more isolated, not just in terms of sense of community, but also in terms of helping out and receiving help. Less than half of them, they feel they are giving and receiving help in their work.
If I may add something to the question that we got before, drawing on the previous Brighton Fuse project, what came out was also that the super fuse firms were also the ones that were struggling more to get those skilled employees they wanted to bring in their companies. So they were going and employing freelancers because they couldn't get access to those skills otherwise. So for them, freelancers were a reservoir of fuse skills. Given that this community is highly innovative, because our stats show that the degree of innovation, both process and products, is very high, freelancers are, for companies, and this goes back to your point, like they really contribute highly to their performance, especially for the super fuse.
Cool.
Hi there. Can the panel expand a little bit on this really interesting finding about the gender pay gap amongst Brighton freelancers? Women apparently are averaging something like between 10 and 15% less as freelancers. This is something I found really interesting when we met before, but could you each tell me a little bit more about what you think about why that might be the case?
Which is anyway in line with the average in the UK, because we found that it's more or less quite spread towards the all economic sectors in the UK. It's not just about freelancers, but in general, women earn less, and they tend to work even more hours, longer hours than men.
I was surprised and not surprised at the same time. But we wondered and we discussed this amongst ourselves why that might be the case when there is freedom to name a price, you know. Why are women earning less? And a few really interesting, I asked my women interviewees what they thought, and quite often they said that a whole range of reasons. One, that women do not like to charge a higher price because maybe they undervalue themselves, or women see themselves as, describe themselves as more creative and artistic, and they don't name a price that they should in relation to their creative skills. So it still is baffling, and it would be good to hear from our audience what they think as well.
However, we did find that women are happier Slightly.
Which is, yeah, so that's the other.
So maybe we should
finding.
decrease the male wages, right? And then we'll all be happy.
And that they
Pleasant.
network more than men.
Women network
right?
more than men, and women,
Yeah.
yes, so they, very interesting.
And this is one of the reasons why we decided to ask questions about well-being. Because, for example, in the Fuse one, we didn't ask these questions because we were talking about firms, and we thought that firms were more neutral, in terms of gender than freelancers. But here we found this difference, so we thought it was very, very important not to base our results on performance of freelancers, just on economic figures, and that's why we ask questions about well-being.
Cool. The guy there, and then this man in the blue shirt called Greg.
Hello. Just wondering what ideas or plans the panel have in terms of actually implementing the policies in the recommendation section.
Well, we've got a meeting tomorrow in the Westminster Hub with senior civil servants from both the Department of Culture, Media and Sport and Business Innovation and Skills. And so we'll have an open-eared audience. So if you've got any ideas, we'll be happy to pass them along tomorrow. I mean, it's always difficult, right, to have an influence, but I think, the first point is to actually have that evidence base. I think that's what we found with the first Brighton Fuse, is that once you actually have the data, you've mapped out what the economic contribution is, you can show that this is important, and then you can start to think about, what are the blocks, and talk about, let's actually back what's working. Let's back these successful entrepreneurial freelancers and remove the blocks that are in their way, rather than penalising them or ignoring them, as John was saying, in the way that has been happening so far. So
I think it's quite a difficult thing to address because the government might be a bit reticent to do something that benefits this quite nebulous group of people, because we could be like, we've made these recommendations, and the people that they apply to, some of them work for umbrella companies, and some of them are sole traders, and some of them are limited companies, and some of them are kind of employees, and some of them are van drivers, and it's quite difficult to, you almost need this sorting to happen first, so that everybody knows who the true self-employed are, which I think was recommended by IPSE in a manifesto they published earlier in the year, but they had quite a bit of pushback on it because I think a lot of freelancers, who, as we established, are quite willful, thought that it was just basically a way for them to be sorted into a box to make sure they were paying the right taxes. So it's sort of a bit of a catch-22.
Have you got the... Oh, sorry.
Greg in the blue shirt, Phil, thanks. So my best friends are freelancers. And indeed, when I was made redundant, I became a freelance consultant. When I didn't get a job after 6 months, I became a strategic consultant. So I understand and I recognise the picture. I'm particularly interested in the policy goals. In other words, is being a freelance a state of transience or a state of permanence? In other words, it's probably Fuse 3, but how many of those freelancers are somewhere between PAYE, boring, always will be employee, and entrepreneurial, and possibly employing other people who will be freelancers but then become, in other words, the virtuous circle rather than the vicious circle? And there's probably a study there.
Jonathan, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the interesting findings of the research was that what freelancers resisted doing is comparing themselves with employees. So it wasn't a question of what would you rather be, a freelancer or an employee? It was what would you rather do, be a freelancer or grow a company? So that's where they saw themselves, which maybe suggests that actually freelance is a stage in terms of growing a company rather than a stage in terms of becoming an employee. But let's hear what the panel thinks.
Yeah, we found in the interviews that very often people get quite philosophical and think about where am I actually going with this freelance career? And in many cases, of course, we found people that have followed a path which has led to them setting up a company, and then taking on enough work so that they can take on employees. And so that you start to have monetizable, employment-creating business at the end of this. And other people are doing their own personal research and development. Somebody writing a programming language, people doing artworks, taking on commissions, people starting families and so forth. It does seem to be a growing part of the population, the working population, over the last 10 years. That there were recent newspaper headlines saying UK is becoming the self-employment capital of Europe, which is a bit of an exaggeration because it's still less than other countries. But in terms of the growth, the trend is that it's increasing. So I think what this all shows is that we have to start getting used to having a larger part of the working population which is freelance, and think about what their aspirations are and where they're going, I think.
So the policy could be to ease and accelerate that transition.
Yeah, I think so.
Hey, it's quite cool being a freelance, I quite like this, it's good.
Yeah, or to ignore them or disadvantage them, right? So, which is what happens really.
Okay. So the guy with the beard there. Sorry, I don't know how to describe.
Did you ask questions about how long people have been freelancing for? What was kind of average length of time people have been freelancing?
The average is 9 years, so quite a lot of experience. But still, we have about, I think, 20% of the sample who started 2 years or less. They've been freelancing for less than 2 years. Yeah.
Right.
So early career freelancers.
So what was the average? Sorry.
The average is 9 years. About 20% of them have 2 years.
That's a lot.
2 year or less experience. Yeah.
But only 16% of our freelancers are full-time freelancers.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So in the sample, just 16%.
Only 16% are full-time?
Yes, 16.8%.
Right.
And you have to bear in mind, of course, that we are, in some ways, we're surveying the survivors, right? So these are the ones that are still freelance. There will be many more that have been trying for 2, 3, 4, 5 months and given up and gone and got a job.
So what's the average age of the more successful super-fused freelancer?
Do we have
They tend to be pretty young. Below 40 is the average. I mean,
the overall average is 41 years, but we did not check if
we could check.
You're just making me feel old.
We didn't check the super fused.
We could check that.
Okay, so yeah, and then if you could maybe take the microphone to the guy with the pink shirt at the back, so that.
It was something that you said that actually triggered this question on me, which is like, what is the relationship with the freelance work at the moment and the economic crisis? Is there any, or do you find any relationship?
So what's what's the relationship then between people's decisions to become freelancers and the economic conditions in which?
We talk to other academics about that, and they have this trend. They have trends. People keep saying that freelancing is associated with economic crisis, and it might be partly true. But then, if you look at a longer term trend, the freelance has been increasing over the last 20, 30 years, regardless economic growth or recession. So, we still don't know whether there is an association or not, but it's a fact that the number of freelancers or self-employed workers has been increasing significantly in the UK, regardless the growth rate of the economy.
I have a quote from an interview which goes, "It's us that has taken the country out of recession, and we need recognition for that."
We did find, in terms of the barriers that people pointed to, the current economic conditions as being one of the most important barrier that they need to face at this time, as we found with the firms in 2013.
And could you drill down on that a bit? What is it about the current economic conditions?
There's too much competition. There's not enough work.
It's probably also probably also that freelancers are always at the very bottom of the supply chain. So if you have one late payment to some business along the way, and then that trickles down, and by the time it gets to you, you might have to wait 6 weeks for a big contract, for a big invoice to come in, and that can ruin you basically.
Yeah. So a cash flow kind of challenge.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
We should also bear in mind that this sector, the creative and digital sector, let's say, has been growing in the previous years despite the crisis. So in the Fuse 1 project took place exactly in the worst period of the economic crisis, and these firms on average, they were experiencing a growth rate of 15%. So I guess that a sector that is able to grow so fast, even during an economic crisis, then I think also freelancers will benefit from that, I guess.
You mentioned briefly the relationship between Britain and the rest of Europe, and I was just wondering, looking at the international picture, are there other countries, are there practices or policies in other countries that you know of that you think are quite inspiring, or are there other countries who are doing it better, and how does Britain stack up against the international scene?
Oh, it's a really good question.
Yeah,
who's going to take it?
We talked to a lawyer and who worked on a European Union study about self-employed workers. They call them IPROs, independent professionals across Europe. And they said that one of the main difference between the UK and many other countries relates with the difference between civil law and common law, apparently. So they said that in the UK, there are nearly no entry barriers. If you want to start to be a freelancer, you can start today. You don't need to register. And that's one of the issues we found with the definition of freelancers. Well, in other countries like France, Italy, Spain, for example, you have to register to be a freelancer. You need to be a VAT registered from the beginning. And so you have all sorts of bureaucratic issues to solve before you start. So you won't be able to be a freelancer from day one if you have an idea or if you get a client, a potential client. So I think it's very difficult to compare. Although this is a report is public available, and they are comparing the self-employed workers around Europe. And I think that one of the few similar thing was that freelancing is growing everywhere. That's pretty much the only common issue around Europe.
But we are interested in comparing the level of well-being across countries. So we are actually now engaging with IPSE, the Association of Independent Professionals and Self-Employed, because they would like to compare across countries what are the challenges and the level of well-being that people are facing. And this we are going to do with them, sitting in a think tank, so we will be able to tell you more about also the international perspective on that.
So we've got time for a couple more. The guy right at the very back at the top with the checked shirt on.
Hi there. I feel like I've missed a figure somewhere, but I couldn't see whether you've been able to see or collect information about roughly what percentage of people employed in Brighton would be identified as freelancers.
We didn't have
No.
the figure.
We can. Again, this is one of the problems with how freelancers classify themselves, because there is no definitive figure.
But because the reason I asked the question is because if it's 1% or 0.5%, it's very different from if it's 10%.
So nationally, I think it's about 15%, and Brighton is said by somebody in the past to have about roughly twice the number of freelancers as the national average. Is Katie still here, actually? Yes, you have that figure, don't you?
This figure is available somewhere on the Brighton Council website. The national average was closer to 9%, and the Brighton average was closer to 12 or 13, but I'm sorry.
You can find it in the census, the last census report, which does show that it is significantly more in Brighton, but also it's grown since the last census.
So it sounds like it's roughly between 12 and 15%, which is not insignificant, I would suggest. Okay, so the guy at the back with the glasses, then the guy in the red jumper.
Hiya. So something that really interests me is when we started up our business, one of the biggest struggles we had was accountancy. So we've got John here from Crunch, which is handy.
You want to do a sales job on it?
No, not quite. But one of the biggest struggles for us was actually finding an accountant or actually doing it ourselves. So something really interesting would have been, I guess, to understand, out of the freelancers that you kind of interviewed and questioned, what kind of percentage of those were actually managing their accounts themselves, opposed to actually going to someone like Crunch?
I'm not sure if that was actually asked in the research, was it?
We didn't ask that. We asked, I think we have what percentage of their time they spend doing administrative work, I think. I think we showed this, you showed that figure, but we didn't ask if they actually, you know, do all the accountancy by themselves.
I mean, it's definitely quite a small number employ an accountant to do it, because
Really?
we have those kind of figures for our marketing projections and stuff, and our kind of addressable market and that sort of thing. So it seems to be there's almost kind of like a rite of passage story that every freelancer has, where they go, oh, I went freelance, I earned all this money in my first year, and I didn't save anything for tax, and I did my self-assessment, and I couldn't pay it. Oh God, it seems like kind of everybody does that. Yeah, I see a few people chuckling. So I think it's kind of there's definitely something to be done around awareness there, not necessarily by an accountancy firm or people like us, but possibly just the government. They do have their awareness campaigns of the self-assessments, but they're more awareness campaigns about you have to get it filed or we'll fine you, not around if you're starting your own business, don't forget to keep all your records properly, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's cool.
So, yeah.
An observation, I suppose, and also a clarification or question. The observation is, I think, around the networking side of things, is that in my experience, it was interesting that you said about the social media. That would probably fit the sector, in particular. But sometimes I think there's a confusion between networking, as in working your network and communicating and what have you, and going to networking events. And in my experience, quite often going to the people who are busy and have lots of work on don't go to networking events because they're busy and have lots of work on, and they network out of necessity. So they talk to other people about work they're doing and find other people to help them or what have you. And usually they're getting their work because they're networking in that way, and that's what makes them busy. Quite often, in my experience, I used to go to networking events, and because I wasn't busy, and I used to find myself in rooms with people who were all trying to sell me something whilst I was trying to sell them something. It was all rather demoralising. So I stopped going to networking events and concentrated on working my network, and all of a sudden things took off. That was great. So that was just an observation. The question, rather more, and this is probably going to put a real dampener on the whole evening now. Was,
oh, great.
I'm sorry. Sorry, Phil.
Downer.
But I was really interested about or surprised at the recommendation about the employment rights. And in fact, I sort of heard a few sharp intakes of breath when that first bullet point went up. And I just wondered whether you could just expand on what you mean by that, just out of interest, really.
Yeah, I mean, it's essentially what we're finding is that people are missing out on sickness pay, holiday pay, insurance, pensions and so forth, maternity, paternity leave that they wouldn't find if they were employees. And so some of those things that you can see that it ought to be equalised at a policy level. Some of the others, and I think freelancers are very fair-minded about this, that many of them will say, yeah, well, this is our lifestyle choice, and why should we make somebody else pay for them? So, you know, it needs to be done at a case-by-case level, I think. But I think it is important to bear in mind, particularly with the things like innovation policy, things like tax reliefs for creative industry, tax credits and so forth. You know, all these things from the point of view of having a company and having employees. And there's no reason why freelancers, who often collect the same sorts of information through their own personal accounting and so on, shouldn't be eligible for those same benefits. But generally, this is not the mindset of the policymakers, which is what we're really trying to highlight, really. But not across the board, but considering it on a case-by-case basis, I think.
what we also found out that there is always lack of awareness about schemes that may be there and accessible to freelancers, and so there is definitely a need to increase that awareness. But also on the other hand, that people always lack, freelancers tend to not to think long-term in terms of financial planning. So for instance, you should save 6 months in advance if you want to go on maternity leave. People are not used to think that way, so maybe some kind of education or support on long-term financial planning would be definitely beneficial. And this is what we would like to recommend also tomorrow to our panel of discussion.
Okay, we're going to draw it to a close there. I think sad, marginalised individuals who are forced into the freelance lifestyle because you've got no other choice may be a dominant paradigm, but this research has really suggested that at least in this city, in this sector, that's patently not the case, that it's a choice that many of you make. I was personally surprised at the level of income that the freelancers actually receive. It was more than I kind of expected, albeit in certain areas like the very pure arts, it was very low. But there's certainly a job to be done to convince people that that freelancers are not this challenging, problematic a group of people who are always out to screw the revenue on taxes, but actually a really crucial part of a healthy, thriving digital and creative cluster. And they play a real part in keeping that cluster buoyant and valuable. So I think, from that perspective, it's a fantastic piece of research. I think it really adds to the original Brighton Fuse project, and once again, it gives some real dimension to the idea of what a cluster is. It really gets beneath the surface of it in a combination of empirical research and case studies which demonstrate how real people think about that. And as Jonathan said, very many of you think very deeply about what it means to be a freelancer and what you're trying to do with your life and what choices you make in terms of what you do with your life and how freelancing enables you to do that. So a fantastic piece of research. I like you, just before we all decamp through those doors to the bar for our lukewarm white wine, to give it up for our panel of researchers tonight. And John. And they'll be around in the bar if you want to ask them questions, I think.